Welcome back to the Dirt Diaries, explorers. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss a new episode or new archaeology discoveries. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, don't forget to rate and comment. It really helps me out. And if you are new here, welcome. I hope you love ancient history, mythology, mystery, and more as much as I do, because my name is Dr. Tendra Kellenberger and I bring the ancient world to you. Because no, this is not ancient aliens. This is the real thing. And of course, these are the Dirt Diaries. And of course, a special shout out and hello to those lounging in the villa, taking notes in the library, and snooping in the restricted section over on Patreon. So last time on Dirt Diaries, well, we finally went beyond the blade and examined some ancient weapons from the Bronze Age, specifically in Egypt and the Aegean. And keeping on the trend of Egypt and the Aegean today, I wanted to look at more art. Why? Because we looked at weapons that were represented in art, some real, some not so much, looking at you, bladed mace. And that's similar to what we see with fantastical beasts in the ancient world, because yes, they had those. These fantastical and mythical beasts existed as a representation of power for these ancient individuals. Sometimes they are found in the company of royalty, but also they are found surrounding the divine beings like gods and goddesses. And so many myths and stories include tales of mythical monsters, right? We see it later on with the Chimera, the Sphinx. Yes, one day we will dive into all of these. And the Lamassu in Mesopotamia. And, of course, griffins. So today we're bypassing the riddle of the Sphinx for now, and we are looking at griffins because even people 3,000 years ago knew about these fantastical beasts and where to find them. So get your bestiaries and mythology books out for this one, as we're looking to see where motifs meet mythology. So for those wondering what a griffin is, I get it. There's a lot of mythical beings out there. I understand there's many a mythical beasts out there, but for here on the Dirt Diaries and really across the board for griffins, a griffin is a fantastical creature that combines the features of a lion with that of an eagle. Yes, it is a combination creature, if that makes sense. And this fantastical being likely originated in ancient Mesopotamia. And you may be wondering, okay, because this is a lion eagle conglomeration, what part goes where? Because yes, you are asking the best questions. So what part goes where? So overall, the body, the tail, and the back legs are usually designated to being a lion, while the wings, the head, and normally the front paws are designated to the eagle. But I have seen instances in my own field, so for the prehistory of the Aegean, where both the front paws and the back paws actually belong to a lion. So really it just depends on the culture, the time period, and all that other stuff. There's a lot of variables going into what goes where for what time period we're talking about and where in the world are we. Now, you may have heard, okay, well, griffins may have originated from Mesopotamia. Well, what's the earliest representation that we have there? So the earliest representation that I'm not really going to dive into today is actually dating anywhere from 3500 BCE to 3100 BCE. And they really show up on early cylinder seals, and they're really, really cute. But because of how many griffins and areas that we're talking about today, not everybody could make varsity. And out of all of the topics that I'm talking about today, literally a minimum of 2 deep dive episodes could be coming out of all of them. So in total, if we were doing, so literally like upwards of 15 topics we could deep dive into just from this one episode alone. So this is more of a griffin overview, if you will, a tasting episode, a chef special, really. So when we're looking at griffins and fantastical beings, where are we going to look but Egypt? Yep, we're going back to the Nile. So in Egypt, yes, we do see griffins. We see griffins here and there. They're not a prime focus in terms of what motifs they want to show power. Of course, if you've been here, we've talked about ancient weapons and, of course, the smiting scene in Egypt. They really preferred that. Of course, they are using the Master of Animals motif, which is also originating in Mesopotamia. And yes, Egypt and Mesopotamia actually have a super long trade connection going thousands of years back. But in Egypt, while we do see griffins being used, there seems to be a preference to use sphinx, whatever the plural is. So in Egypt, sphinxes seem to be really the brand choice from the pharaohs. And sometimes they are even shown in the form of a griffin or a sphinx to dominate over their enemies, which is really, really cool, but also makes sense as another image of power. But okay, when the pharaoh is not shown as such a creature, where else can we see griffins? Well, early on, before Egypt was even Egypt, we actually see a griffin on a pallet, very similar to the Narmer pallet. It was actually found in the same kind of hoard at the Temple of Horus. And this pallet is not the Narmer pallet. This pallet is actually known as the Two Dogs pallet. And this pallet dates to 3200 BCE. So what do we see on this pallet but two dogs that are framing the top part of the pallet, and these are wild dogs. And then if you move down, and of course you can see in the image here, when you move down and you look around the mixing circle where you would crush up the cosmetics to use, we see some other fantastical beasts. These, of course, not griffins. These are actually, well, they come from the big cat family. It's another fantastical being made up of two animals, and take your guess on what you think their name is, because scholars actually refer to them as Serpopards. Yep. And why are they named this? It is because they look like a conglomeration of both serpents and leopards. And they are named this way because their body looks like just a normal big cat, leopard, and then their necks are all long and crazy like a serpent. And we actually see Serpopards in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, going as far back as early dynastic periods. And actually, a fun fact about this beast is that they are also found on the backside of the Narmer palette, which is really, really cool. And these also appear on some seals from Mesopotamia as well, where griffins are also found. And these seals actually date to around the 4th millennium BCE, and they are found from the city of Uruk. And of course, scholars have named this creature a Serpopard because there is actually no word for them in Egyptian texts. And when we see them, you may be wondering, well, why would Egypt want this creature? You know, they're not really using griffins, but why would they want this creature? What would strike Egypt's fancy here? Well, it always comes back to power. And with power, the pharaoh is usually always shown as being the conqueror of chaos, that the pharaoh is instilling law and order over the chaotic natural world. So that's also why on the back of the Narmer palette, we see two Serpopards actually being leashed and having their necks intertwined, because it is really highlighting Egypt's power over the known and the unknown world at this time. So really, it always comes back to militaristic and political propaganda. So when we go, we're still on the Two Dogs palette. When we go a little bit lower from these creatures, we see just at the bottom this little cutie. And yes, this is a griffin, and I love him. He's adorable. And so when I talked earlier about what really makes a griffin, we already right away from this image already notice a difference. Can you point it out? Yeah, it's in the bird head of the creature. Already, normally we're used to seeing eagles' heads, but here it already looks to be more of a falcon-like head, which makes sense because this is Egypt and Horus is their main falcon-headed god. The pharaoh is also seen as the living embodiment of Horus, so it makes sense to have a fantastical beast with a falcon head. And throughout Egypt's history, we kind of get two griffin types, you could kind of say. And that is really the pharaonic griffin and then the later Aegeanized griffin that does make its way to Egypt, which really the Aegeanized griffin doesn't come down to Egypt until the New Kingdom. And so the New Kingdom is mid 16th century, 1550 BCE, give or take a few decades, and depending on your chronology. And of course, the Two Dogs palette is 3200. So we're looking at over 1500 years until we get another kind of addition into the Egyptian canon of fantastical beasts. And really, when we see the Aegean griffin in the New Kingdom, we see this on a ceremonial axe, which we'll get to, and then really from the site of Tel El Daba, which this could be a whole multi-series right there. Tel El Daba, all of the stuff that is coming out of this site. Who are the artists? Are they actually Egyptian artists, or are they Minoan artists or Aegean artists who were, trained and then traveling around the Eastern Mediterranean world? Or were they Egyptian artists who were trained in, prehistoric Greece during the Bronze Age? And there's so many different things about this. Tel El Daba also plays a large role in the understanding of the Theron eruption and that chronology. So already we could dive into so much with Tel El Daba, but there is an Aegean griffin in a wall painting at this palace. So very, very interesting, and we'll get to it in a sec. But during the Old Kingdom, when we're looking at griffins in Egypt, there are really only a few, like you can count them on one hand, only a few types of examples of griffins coming out of Old Kingdom Egypt. And they're really poorly preserved. But already from the Old Kingdom on, we are seeing an association to power and royalty with the griffin. We're already seeing that association being made. And when we're actually seeing the Egyptian pharaonic griffin, it's really interesting because sometimes they don't exactly look like griffins. They appear more at first glance to be a sphinx, but when you look deeper, especially during the Middle Kingdom, you will see that they're not wingless griffins, which do exist as well, but they're actually depicted as having their wings like slicked back to their body. So they're just not outstretched like we normally see. And we'll get to wingless griffins when we get to, the Aegean world. Griffins come in all shapes and sizes, wings, no wings, crests, no crests, everything in the ancient world. So if we're looking at a, pharaonic representation of a griffin or the pharaoh as a griffin, we actually have to go back to Dynasty 12. Remember when we looked at the pectoral from Amenemhat III that was found in the mortuary temple of Senwosret III from, Middle Kingdom and everything? We're looking to the same dynasty, Dynasty 12, and we're looking to the same family, actually. This necklace pendant actually belonged to Amenemhat III's sister, and she was known as Princess Mereret. And here, already in this image, we see how the pharaonic griffin is tied to power. This is a beautiful artistic representation of the pharaoh with more of a falcon or Horus head here, literally dominating, stepping on his enemies. We all know what this is. This is clearly asserting one's dominance, showing that you have conquered the enemy in the entirety. Here, the king is easily seen as dominating the known world around him, dominating his enemies, showing that he will always come out on top. Also, during Dynasty 12, we get some high-ranking tombs at Beni Hassan, and within some of these tombs, we also get representations of griffins. But here, rather than being more pharaonic griffins, we have a different take on a griffin that is kind of reminiscent to what we saw on the Two Dogs palette. So specifically, we have to look at Khnumhotep II's tomb down at Beni Hassan. And this is where a griffin with V-shaped wings appears. We also see a more slender, entirely feline body, and it looks immediately like the wings and the body belong to two separate creatures. There's not this conglomeration of it together like when we normally think of griffins. This looks like they took the wings and then put the body right on it, and there we have a griffin from Beni Hassan. And here the feline actually has a much longer neck, but while the face of the animal looks more feline, it is still belonging to a falcon, but the beak here is not as apparent as we have seen in the past. And the Egyptian term for this animal we see throughout the Middle Kingdom, and we also see it in the coffin texts, which were funerary texts that were popular during the Middle Kingdom period. Earlier was the pyramid text, and then after the coffin text, mainly in the New Kingdom onward, is going to be, of course, the Book of the Dead, which we did a whole podcast episode on for all of the funerary texts of ancient Egypt. It is the handbook to the afterlife. And this type of griffin, the more speckled feline figure with the V-shaped wings, this figure is more often seen on Egyptian magic wands because, yes, the Egyptians did use magic wands, and they were used for many different reasons. We can go into a whole episode on that one day as well. And when they are shown on, Egyptian wands and everything, they're also shown sometimes to have collars or even be leashed. But then, hop, skip, and a jump after the Middle Kingdom, we get through the reign of the Hyksos in the Second Intermediate Period, and then we get Dynasty 18, which really begins the New Kingdom with Ahmose I. Well, on a ceremonial axe head of his, we see not only, of course, the king smiting his enemy on a register above, but just at the bottom, as you can see here, there is a griffin. And this griffin doesn't look Egyptian. Nay, this looks like an Aegean type griffin. And with the Aegean type griffin, these griffins are distinctly lion and eagle. Now, of course, as we saw with Egypt, it was more lion or speckled feline with wings, or a lion with a falcon head. Nay, not in the Aegean. So the Aegean griffin has more of a beak that looks similar to that of a vulture. And most of the time, it'll be depicted with raised wings from the profile, where one is seen behind the other, so you will see both. And in their body, sometimes there will be a rosette right about here where their shoulder is, and going down their back of their neck, there may actually be spirals. And the spirals are really important because we see this a lot in the Aegean world. They also may have crests. So if no wings, these griffins likely would have upraised crests. If you've ever seen, I believe they're cockatoos, but the birds that have the feathers that stick up like this, it's kind of the same thing of how these ancient griffins would have been depicted with crests standing up like that. But what's interesting and kind of a pain in the butt at the end of the day is the tips of their crest and the tips of their wings look almost identical. So if you are ever reconstructing frescoes of griffins of the Bronze Age Aegean, you might be in a bit of a pickle, because I found myself in such a pickle. Me and friends, back when I was a grad student, we were on a fellowship where we were actually reconstructing the throne room of Knossos, and we were looking at the griffins and the griffin frescoes there and trying to reconstruct it using, of course, Evan's excavation notes, photos, and more, followed by the work done by Mark Cameron, Elizabeth Shank, and so many others. And let me tell you, looking at these fresco fragments, it is hard to determine whether or not it is an upraised crest or if it's a wingtip. But I'll go back on a Knossos throne room rant in a bit. But Aegean griffins. So early on, we see representations of griffins in the Aegean world pop up really around the Middle Minoan II period, so think roughly 1750 BCE. And we see them on both Crete, the mainland of Greece, and in the Cyclades. So all of these Cycladic islands, the Greek islands as we know them today. And as time goes on, really once we get to the late Bronze Age and the beginning of the late Bronze Age, their popularity really picks up. They really become almost a crowd or a fan favorite back in the day. And they pick up in popularity on Crete, really in the form of seals and, of course, from the Palace of Knossos and wall paintings. There seems to be a preference for them in seals and in ivory carvings from the mainland. And we see a lot of them represented in wall paintings, specifically from the Cycladic island of Thera, whose modern name is Santorini. And going back to the ceremonial acts of Ahmose I and the griffin there, I want to touch base on that one again, because this is really the Aegeanized griffin that we're seeing already from the Middle Minoan period onward. So if we look at the griffin here on the ceremonial axe, it is distinctly Aegean. Its beak here is long like a vulture rather than the shorter form that we would see if it were a falcon head being depicted. And along the neck in the outer part of the griffin, we actually see spirals, which this axe is a really, really cool blend of both the Egyptian and Aegean artwork coming together. One being a perfect representation of pharaonic power, and another being a fantastical beast from the Aegean world. But to Knossos we go, because we gotta talk about the throne room here. Truly, this throne room has given me nightmares in the past. And we know that some palaces in the ancient world did have griffins represented in their entire artistic repertoire. And we know that griffins were represented in different palaces during this time. And really, that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. They are seen as powerful mythical figures that really represent a world outside of their own. They also represent the fantastical and mythical realm around them. And that, as royalty, they would have been seen as having domain over both the mortal realm and the unknown, the known and the unknown, the fantastical and the mundane. So to the throne room, which if we look through the architectural layout of the Palace of Knossos today, yes, it does look like a labyrinth. We could talk about that and have a whole podcast episode on the ancient Greek labyrinth, but alas. So you got a serpentine through the ancient architecture, and then we find our way at the top, throne room. I literally feel like I could walk blindfolded through the Palace of Knossos. So the throne room at the Palace of Knossos already architecturally has ceremonial and religious ties, because where the throne is, if you were to sit down, you would look immediately across the room to a lustral basin. Of course, we can dive into that in the future, and it needs its whole deep dive, so let me know if you want that deep dive. And when we look at the artistic narrative, the visual narrative that surrounds the room, we are also taken into a different environment, a different setting. That has to do with religion, ceremonies, power, and more. And we have to talk about the fact that when Sir Arthur Evans was digging this puppy up in the early 20th century, this room, of course, looked a lot different, and we know a little bit of what it may have looked like because of the excavation photos, which shows a lot of these fresco pieces in situ, meaning as it was when it was buried. And some of them are just not included in what we see today with the throne room's reconstruction. So what we see today with the throne room's reconstruction is not what we would have seen if we were a Minoan from the Bronze Age. No, nay, nay. Arthur Evans said, I see you, but what about this? So, first and foremost, we gotta start with the fact that there is a massive fragment that just was not included in the reconstruction whatsoever. It is known as the palm fresco fragment, or at least I refer to it as that since I had to draw it for the fellowship. But this piece we actually see in situ in the images from the excavation. It's located right next to the throne. This puppy was meant to be here. And Evan said, nah. Anywho, after they took it off of the wall, well, it was brought to the museum. So it was brought to the Heraklion Museum, and then it was lost. Yeah, they lost this massive fresco fragment. And it was only when the Heraklion Museum was getting redone that they refound the fragment. And so when me and my colleagues, when we were on this fellowship to reconstruct the throne room, we had to look back at the excavation photos like this one to say, why was this not included? So with this room, it's all about symmetry, at least around the throne. So on either side of the throne, we can see it from the palm fragment, there is a paw, but it looks more to be a lion paw than an eagle's talon. And this is really what we see in the Aegean world, that all four paws are more feline rather than the front paws belonging to an eagle. And with this symmetry, already we would be transported into a different environment, one where there are palms, one where there are different sort of flora elements around us, more of almost like a nilotic scene. And today we do have, the floral elements present in the reconstruction of the throne room, but what we're missing is the palm, which would have situated the throne room into its own divine environment. It would have transformed the room into a landscape of power. Okay, I think I'm gonna do like a pink purple look today, because when we talk about the goddess with the griffin at Akrotiri on Santorini in Zesty 3, she's got a lot of purple, so I think I'll do a little eye look, a little tribute to her, if you will. And so we're missing out on an almost like idealized setting, that of the griffin. Where is this griffin supposed to be? Also, a complete side note, when I was doing work in Crete and we were working on stuff for the throne room and everything, we literally stopped. We were driving, I forget where we were driving. I think we were just driving back to like the hotel and everything. And my old advisor stopped this big white van that we were driving in, and he told us all to get out. Mind you, we're like on the side of like a Cretan highway. And he's like, okay, we stopped right next to a reed field, and reeds are also seen in the throne room reconstruction, and we also see reeds in the fresco fragments that are preserved today. So we stop on the side of the road, and he's like, look, there's all of these reeds. And he's like, this is the environment of the griffin. And I don't even remember what my face did, because I was like, this is also a mythical being. What a wild day that was. Just reconstructing and looking for the environment of the griffin to get a better understanding of, you know, the fantastical landscape that they would have been a part of. But to literally stop on the side of the road to have this discussion of this is the environment of the griffin kind of seemed out of pocket at the time. And the more I talk about it with my friends who were part of the fellowship and were in the van with me, we often think about like, how did this happen? How? Anywho, continuing on. So with the griffins being on either side of the seated ruler in the throne room of Knossos, we already see what power would have looked like, right? If you are sitting in the throne and you have two fantastical beasts on either side of you, that's power. That really shows your domination and domain over the known and the unknown, the natural and the fantastical. And it's really, really cool because we also see this aspect of, you know, a seated female figure with lions on either side of her chair from Çatalhöyük, which is a Neolithic site in modern day Turkey. So really interesting that we are seeing the aspect of two fantastical beasts being on either side of an individual. And this, of course, may go back to the master and mistress of animals motif, which I really want to dive into soon. And being on either side of the seated royal individual would have reaffirmed their status as the ruler, almost as they had the right to rule. And this is really fitting because this also would have cemented that the ruler was semi-divine or divine and did have ties to this mythical and fantastical being. Also, a side note, as I'm talking about, you know, griffins of the throne room, what is also interesting is trying to piece together when we were working on it whether the two griffins on the either side of the throne would have had raised wings or a raised crest because of the fragments that do survive. And what's interesting is some fragments from the excavation notes, I think they were found in the corner. They didn't have the same background color. They didn't have the same red ochre color that the rest of the room has. And for reference, the throne room is all of a red background. It does have some undulating bands of white and red. And then we have two striped lines at the top part of the walls near the ceiling. But what's interesting is a few of the fragments, I'm thinking of one major one that may be a crest or a wingtip, actually has a yellow background. But what's interesting is when this throne room was destroyed, there were fires, there was destruction everywhere. And what happens when frescoes are heated up to an insane amount of heat? They actually change color. And if you've ever been to Pompeii or Herculaneum, you will see the same thing, where a red background, when there is a lot of heat on that art piece, it will actually change the color from a red to a yellow, which is really, really cool. But for this to happen, the piece, the art, has to experience a ton of heat. It's not just like, ooh, it's a little toasty. No, it's destruction. But of course, as a ruler that absolutely can mean that you have ties to the divine. And as the Wanox and the Wanasa of the prehistoric Aegean, so the lord or the lady, those are their titles, being surrounded by the griffin would have actually raised them to a divine status. And when we're looking at divine figures and their associations to this creature, we got to leave Crete and we got to go to Santorini. We're looking at the site of Akrotiri. Specifically, we're going to the building known as Zesty 3. And Akrotiri is actually known as the Bronze Age Pompeii to scholars. There's also some discourse on Akrotiri, whether or not it is perhaps, has mythical ties to Atlantis. Akrotiri also deserves its own episode because it's such a crazy site to be in and visit. I went years ago with my husband and excavations are still ongoing. They've only found a very small portion of this town. Okay, so we are going to Zesty 3 because already from the painting program inside, we also see connections to the sacred, to the divine, to ritual, to ceremony, all of that kind of stuff. And a fun fact about Zesty 3 is during excavations, a golden ibex was also recovered here. And back in the early 2000s, X-ray fluorescence was done on it, and it was found that the gold used in the ibex was similar to the gold that is found from Varna, which is located on the Black Sea. So it's believed that the gold here from Akrotiri actually came from Varna, which is really cool. Okay, but Zesty 3. So going into Zesty 3, we're really going to be looking at room 3 because room 3 has a really interesting visual narrative going on in it. There's also a lustral basin in here. And honestly, we should just go on a building tour of this place to go over all of the art because there's so much. But the art in room 3 as a kind of like Spark Note edition is really depicting coming of age rituals, rites, and ceremonies of a young woman. So we see women in different ages, right? If you are looking at the lustral basin, if you look right over it, you see the fresco called the Fresco of the Women, and there's 3 women depicted here. One is known as the necklace swinger because she's swinging a necklace. We're great at naming things. And then we have the wounded woman who is actually sitting on a rocky outcrop and she cut the bottom of her foot actually. So bloodletting is really big in this fresco narrative. And then to her right, we actually see a younger woman. She's younger than both of the other women due to her hairstyle. And she is also veiled. So we call her the veiled woman. And the veiled woman, she actually is looking behind her. And behind her on the other wall is actually a depiction of a shrine that has, something similar to bullhorn iconography on top of it. Normal iconography to see for a Minoan shrine. And there's blood on it. So likely has to do with, menstruation and everything. And then if we look above that scene, above that register, we also see the divine scene going on with offerings. Above the shrine scene, we actually see 2 women, and they are known as the crocus gatherers. So let's talk the divine scene really quickly. So in this scene, from left to right, we see a young woman, likely a priestess, and she's actually pouring saffron flowers out of her basket into a larger container that also has more saffron flowers in it. And then moving over to the right, we see a monkey who is standing on his back legs. He is beautifully depicted in a light blue. And he's standing up and he's taking one of these saffron flowers and he's turning to the goddess. And this is the main goddess that we know in the Aegean world. We refer to her as the Potnia Theron. And what's interesting is you have to pay attention to the architecture that they're also on. So if you look, the priestess is on one level, and then if you look up, the monkey has one leg on the same level as her, and then is stepping up with his other foot to be on another level. So the monkey is seen as an attendant to the goddess, that he is this go-between between the goddess and her priestess, between the goddess and the mortals. And then, of course, we have the monkey whose upper leg is on that pedestal. And then the goddess's lower leg is placed on that one. Of course, we see the goddess at the far right end. And behind her is a griffin. And he's adorable. He's one of my favorites. He's so cute. And just the spirals and the wings are just beautiful. So how do we know she's a goddess? Well, Hierarchy of scale is a great tool to help you determine either who is a divine figure, who's a ruler, who is the most important person and why. It's a great starting point. So hierarchy of scale is usually going to be the largest person depicted. And then of course, it's because of the amount of jewelry that she has on and the colors that are used for her. Well, purple is a rare color during this time. Purple is made by the crushing of thousands of murex shells. And inside of them, you would have to break open their shells and you're looking for this itty bitty little ink sac. And you would need thousands to dye anything or to create purple color. So because of its rarity, it's also being saved for the most important person. And what's really interesting is in her top is also purple. It's faded, of course, from thousands of years in the volcanic eruption. But her top is also purple, and embroidered in her top are actually saffron flowers. So it's just overall a beautiful depiction. And we also know she's a goddess because she does have ties to the griffin behind her. And if you look at the griffin, she's sitting both higher than her monkey attendant as well as the griffin. So it's showing that she has domain over both of them. And if we want to go even further, we got to take a look at her jewelry because not only are they beautifully represented, but she has multiple necklace strands on. And the beads here are the key. So in one necklace strand, there are beads of dragonflies. And then in another strand of the necklace, we have ducks. So again, showing her domain over the natural world. So, stepping out of the divine for a little bit and back into power and, royalty, we're going to leave Akrotiri, we're going to leave Thera, leave Santorini. We're going to head to the mainland. Really, we're going to be looking at a little bit of Mycenae with the Megaron there, so the palace, but mainly Pylos. Alrighty, so on the mainland and looking at the palace of Pylos, also known and referred to as the Palace of Nestor, the throne room has actually been reconstructed to show both griffins and lions together. And this really makes sense because they are symbols of power and rulership. Unfortunately, not much of the Megaron at Pylos or Mycenae survives today. And both the lion and the griffin, well, they are seen actually as the foremost predatory quadrupeds in the Aegean world. They are the elite of the elite. They are the best of the best, the most ferocious animals in the ancient Aegean world. And yes, the mainland of Greece back in the day actually did have lions. And when they are portrayed together or with one another, it's really interesting because they are seen as working in tandem with one another and are often seen as hunters or portrayed as hunters of other powerful animals on the mainland. So for the mainland, really, when we see them paired together, they're often fighting or hunting bulls or boars. And then we also see them hunting weaker animals too, like deer and goat. So, back to the throne room at Pylos. So the griffin and the lion have long been associated with one another at the throne room of Pylos and its reconstruction and everything, really since Balagan's rediscovery of the 13th century BCE throne room. And again, looking at the reconstruction here, you can see how they are seen really with one another. Really, their imagery complements one another as images of power. And they are just peacefully right next to each other. One is not outshining the other. One is not attacking the other. Nay. No. Peaceful coexistence here, at least in the reconstruction. And with lions and griffins flanking the throne and flanking the one who would sit at the throne, along with the nearly identical layout of the Megara at Pylos and Mycenae, this has led scholars to actually believe and speculate that these animals, the lion and the griffin, may have held some sort of symbolic connection or had a special connection to both of these sites, perhaps even linking both of these sites. Perhaps they each represented one of these sites, which is kind of cool, We've seen Game of Thrones. We know, different animals are used to highlight the different houses. So, I could see that happening here. And it makes sense. You're having two of the most ferocious and predatorial animals who are also known to have divine connections and protective qualities be the emblems of these sites. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense visually to me. Okay, but what if they're fighting each other or the artwork shows a lion fighting a griffin, because we do actually have this, albeit rare. Well, it could be, the two sites going at it with one another, or if the two sites on the mainland, Mycenae and Pylos, if they are together, aligned with one another, then perhaps it is a larger symbolic representation of the mainland versus Crete. So the Minoans versus the Mycenaeans, because we do know that, the Minoans and Mycenaeans are said to have gotten into it with one another, especially during the late Bronze Age. Of course, the Mycenaeans are known to kind of take over Crete later on in the late Bronze Age. So it could be, it's very interesting nonetheless, and is, really fascinating. Maybe something I'll even dig in with my own research, because it makes sense. If you are showing power over what you rule over, power over anything, if you're just trying to construct power, you're going to use animals and everything. We also see this with Egypt and the Hittites and those in Mesopotamia, where especially with the Amarna letters, where they are sending elite gift exchanges to one another, they're also doing it to kind of one up each other. And even in, animal hunting scenes or animal, fighting scenes where animals are fighting one another, it's been speculated by scholars as well for the far eastern Mediterranean that those could be taken as veiled threats of, I'm sending you this really nice gold jewelry box, but at the top it's going to have two animals going at it. And if you know that this animal represents Egypt and this animal represents the Hittites, it could be a veiled threat of, don't come after us or we will, conquer you. But, if you are playing the ancient game, as it were, you're not going to say anything. That would be a bureaucratic and political faux pas. No, you are going to play the elite political ancient game, as it were, and come back with a bigger, more luxurious gift that perhaps has the animal that represents you, your kingdom and everything coming out on top in that scene. It's really, really fascinating how the ancient Game of Thrones was being done and how power was being, portrayed between all of these different empires. It's a game of empires. It's a Game of Thrones. It's the ancient prehistoric Bronze Age Game of Thrones. It's my favorite. And it seems for the Aegean world specifically that lions and griffins are the two heads of the household, and that it seems in the Aegean, the lion and the griffin represent just that. So of course, all of that is just, speculation and everything. There's a lot of discourse on it, especially in terms of like the elite gift exchange and are these technically veiled threats and everything. But because I'm replaying Witcher 3 again, I love Witcher 3. Anywho, because I'm playing it again and I was going through the bestiary and there's so many other, fantastical beings and creatures that I want to cover here on Dirt Diaries, like the history of sirens, the history of harpies, all of that kind of stuff. I was also going over griffins because one of the first quests that you go on is you're trying to take down a royal griffin. And that got me thinking, how are griffins being portrayed, of course, in another aspect? Witcher is not from history or anything, but how are these fantastical and mythical beings being portrayed in other avenues? So within Witcher 3, the griffin is depicted in a similar manner to what we've seen already. It is a fantastical creature with the legs, body, and tail of a lion, and of course the head of an eagle. But if you look at this picture, as it's coming down, it kind of looks like it has the mane of a lion as well, which I know is just the darker feathers from the eagle head, but it really made me think of, a lion's mane. But of course, in the bestiary entry and in the Witcher lore of, these fantastical beasts, griffins, really, they reside in caves, and prior to that, they resided on top of mountains prior to, people coming up, and they were really only hunting, I believe, like small game and goats. And it's really interesting because our griffins, our historical griffins, from the Aegean, from Egypt, and even Mesopotamia, we see some similarities here. For the Aegean, it's more that they're placed into a fantastical, mythical, idealized environment with a lot of flora elements. But when we look at the aspect of the inclusion of tops of mountains, that really gave me like a eureka moment, because in Mesopotamia, when griffins or fantastical beings and beasts are depicted, it's usually with divine figures, gods, goddesses, who are also known to only inhabit the top of high places, the top of mountains. So I was like, that's really interesting for The Witcher to also include that. I don't know, these are just some final thoughts I have. And as we are wrapping up with final thoughts and everything, I know that this was just really a brief overview episode of what griffins are and do we actually find fantastical beasts in the ancient world? Spoiler alert, we do. Of course, later on we will see, of course, sphinxes, we will see chimeras, we will see sirens. Of course, in Mesopotamia, we have the Lamassu, we have Anzu. There's so many different beings that I want to dive into, but this episode was really like a Griffin 101 episode. So let me know below if you want me to do a deep dive on any of these, or whether you want me to deep dive into some of the ancient places that I talked about, Pylos, Knossos, the whole palace reconstruction, anything like that, especially Zesty 3 or the goddess as well. I wanted to include all of it here today in the episode, but I know that there's so much more to be talked about, especially with those places. And when this episode comes out, if you've made it this far, there's a new trip that we're doing next year in 2026. So if you love mythology, ancient history, and archaeology, this is for you because we are traveling to Turkey. Yes, this is really the mythology trip of a lifetime. I know when we did Egypt before, that was like ancient history and archaeology. This trip, of course, ancient history and archaeology lovers unite for it, but it's really like a trip of mythology, and I'm super excited. Of course, we're going to be seeing ancient history. We are going to be seeing what remains of the Hippodrome, where the Roman emperors later on would have their Roman triumphs. We're going to be going to the Hagia Sophia, seeing all of this beautiful architecture, going to all of the museums together. We're going to be doing a hot air balloon trip again, and we, of course, are going to be stopping at 4 different cities this time, so if you're going to be in Turkey, we're going to be doing everything together. And one of the stops is going to be at the site of Ephesus, which of course has the well-known Library of Celsus. But did you know that there's also a temple to Artemis there that also has ties to Cleopatra? Yes, her sister was exiled there, and then Mark Antony ordered her death and she was killed, it's believed, on the steps of the Temple of Artemis where she was claiming sanctuary. And then we are going to Hierapolis and we are going to be stopping at the Plutonion there. What is a Plutonion, you might be wondering? Well, it's believed to be an entryway, a gateway into the ancient Greco-Roman underworld known as Hades. And yes, there is an ancient statue there that has been restored that includes the god of the underworld himself, along with his 3-headed guardian dog, Cerberus. I'm super excited about this. Ancient history lovers, archaeology lovers, and mythology lovers unite because we are traveling again as friends to Turkey next year. So I will see you guys next time. As always, stay curious, keep your books open, and I will see you guys next time on the Dirt Diaries.